I never thought the worst phone call of my life would come on a Tuesday morning while I was debugging code at my Denver office. My sister Caroline's voice cracked through the speaker as she delivered news that shattered my world into pieces. Our father Frank had stage 4 pancreatic cancer with 6 months to live. The family gathered that evening for an emotional meeting where Dad revealed his bucket list visiting Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, and his childhood home in Montana. Without hesitation, I volunteered to fund the entire $20,000 trip, seeing it as my chance to give back to the man who sacrificed everything for our family after Mom died. The moment felt sacred, until Caroline dropped a bombshell that would change everything forever. The weight of Dad's diagnosis hit me differently than it hit Caroline. While she immediately started crying and talking about how unfair life was, I went into problem-solving mode. That's always been my way of dealing with emotional chaos. As a software engineer at a tech company in Denver, I had built a comfortable life for myself at 32. My salary was solid, my savings healthy, and my credit excellent. More importantly, I owed everything to the man now sitting across from me, looking smaller and frailer than I had ever seen him. My mind drifted back to when I was 12 and Mom passed away from a sudden heart attack. Dad could have fallen apart. Instead, he worked 3 jobs to keep our family afloat. During the day, he managed a small auto repair shop. Evenings, he delivered pizzas. Weekends, he did landscaping work for wealthy neighborhoods across town. I remember falling asleep to the sound of his truck pulling into our driveway well past midnight, only to hear his alarm going off before dawn. Caroline was 17 then and dealing with her own teenage drama. She got the luxury of grieving normally while Dad made sure I had everything I needed. School supplies, decent clothes, even a used laptop when I showed interest in computers. He never complained, never made me feel like a burden, never let me see how exhausted he must have been. Now Caroline sat next to her husband Jake, a perpetually unemployed musician who had been living off her teacher's salary for the past 3 years. Jake had this annoying habit of nodding along during serious conversations, as if his opinion mattered, even though he contributed absolutely nothing to our family beyond playing guitar in our living room and eating our food. I pulled out my notebook and started sketching ideas for Dad's trip. Luxury hotels near each destination so he could rest properly. A custom RV rental with medical equipment and a comfortable bed. Maybe even hire a private nurse to travel with us. Dad deserved the absolute best after everything he had given up for us. "I want to do this right," I announced to the room. "Dad, you're going to see everything on that list in style, no expense spared." Dad's eyes filled with tears as he reached across the table to squeeze my hand. His grip felt weaker than it used to, but his gratitude was unmistakable. Caroline smiled and wiped her own tears, seemingly touched by my gesture. That's when Jake cleared his throat. "You know, I've actually done a lot of camping and hiking in that area," he said casually. "Yellowstone can be tricky if you don't know the best routes. I could probably help out." I looked at Caroline, expecting her to shut down this ridiculous suggestion. Instead, she lit up like Jake had just offered to cure cancer. "That's actually a great idea," she said enthusiastically. "Dad, you love Jake. It would be so much more fun with him along." The room went silent. Dad looked confused, glancing between Caroline and me. I felt my stomach drop as I realized what was happening. My generous gesture to honor my dying father was being invaded by a freeloader who saw an opportunity for a free vacation. "I don't think that's necessary," I said carefully. "This is supposed to be a family trip, and with Dad's medical needs, we need to keep the group small." Caroline's expression shifted instantly. "Jake is family Anderson. Dad treats him like the son he never had." The words stung more than she probably intended. Dad did have a son. He was sitting right there offering to spend his life savings on this trip. "Besides," Jake added with a smirk, "I know all the best hiking spots and camping areas. You're more of an indoor guy, right?" I wanted to point out that Dad wouldn't be doing any hiking or camping given his condition. But Caroline jumped in before I could respond. "Jake's right. You spend all day at a computer. Jake actually knows about outdoor stuff." Dad, looking overwhelmed and tired, nodded weakly. If Jake wants to come, that's fine with me. I don't want any family conflict. I swallowed my anger and forced a smile. Of course, Jake can come. But as I walked to my car that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that my heartfelt gesture had just been hijacked by someone who saw my father's final adventure as his personal vacation opportunity. The next 3 weeks became a masterclass in how good intentions can be twisted into something ugly. What started as my attempt to give Dad the trip of a lifetime turned into a nightmare of escalating demands and endless complications. I had originally budgeted $20,000 for a comfortable but modest journey. Now, with Jake in the picture, everything needed to be upgraded. The RV I had reserved wasn't good enough because Jake insisted we needed one with a full entertainment system for his music equipment. The hotels I had booked were apparently too basic because Caroline said Jake had expensive taste and Dad deserved the best. Every modification cost money. The larger RV rental jumped from $400 per day to $700. The upgraded hotel rooms added another $3,000 to the total bill. Special dietary requests because Jake was suddenly a vegetarian pushed meal costs through the roof. Meanwhile, Jake contributed absolutely nothing except opinions and demands. He wanted to bring his guitar collection. He insisted we schedule stops at music venues along the way. He requested that we cater meals from specific restaurants he had seen on food blogs. Each suggestion came with Caroline's full support and Dad's tired agreement. The worst part was watching Jake take credit for my planning. During a family barbecue at Caroline's house, I overheard him telling their neighbors how he was organizing this amazing trip for his father-in-law. He casually mentioned the luxury accommodations and custom medical setup as if they were his ideas. When someone complimented the thoughtfulness of the gesture, Jake soaked up the praise without mentioning who was actually paying for everything. My girlfriend Sarah pulled me aside during that same barbecue. She had been watching the dynamic unfold with growing concern. "Anderson, you realize what's happening here, right?" she said quietly. "They're using you." I wanted to defend my family, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. Caroline had started treating me like a personal ATM, calling with new requests every few days. Jake acted like he was doing me a favor by agreeing to come along. Even Dad seemed to have forgotten that this whole trip was my idea and my financial responsibility. The breaking point came during a family dinner 2 weeks before our planned departure. Dad's condition had worsened faster than any of us expected. The oncologist moved up the timeline, saying we needed to travel within 6 weeks or risk Dad being too weak to enjoy the experience. I had been working overtime every day to earn extra money for the expanded trip budget. My credit cards were approaching their limits and I was considering taking a loan against my retirement account. The total cost had ballooned to over $30,000. I arrived at dinner exhausted and stressed, carrying a folder full of updated itineraries and medical equipment rental agreements. Caroline and Jake were already there, and I noticed Jake was wearing brand new hiking boots that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Those are nice boots," I commented, trying to keep the conversation light. "Caroline got them for me," Jake said proudly. "She said I needed proper gear for all the outdoor activities we're planning." I looked at Caroline in disbelief. She was spending money on Jake's wardrobe while I was draining my savings to fund their vacation. That's when Jake dropped the bomb that changed everything. "Oh, by the way," he said casually while cutting into his steak, "I invited my brother Danny to help with the driving. 4 people is a lot for one driver, especially with all the medical equipment." The room went silent. Dad looked confused. Caroline avoided eye contact. I stared at Jake in shock. "You invited someone else without asking anyone?" "Danny's cool," Jake said defensively. "He's driven cross-country before and he knows the area even better than I do. Plus, he's great with older people." Caroline immediately jumped to Jake's defense. "Anderson, you're being controlling. This is supposed to be about Dad having a good time, not about you micromanaging every detail." I felt my blood pressure rising. "I'm being controlling, I'm paying for everything." "And that's exactly the problem," Caroline snapped. You think because you're paying, you get to make all the decisions. Jake knows what Dad needs better than you do. Dad, heavily medicated and clearly exhausted, just wanted the conflict to stop. If Danny can help with driving, that sounds practical. I looked around the table at my family. Caroline was glaring at me like I was the villain. Jake was smirking like he had won some kind of victory. Dad was too tired to fight for what should have been our special time together. That night, I called Sarah in tears. I think I'm financing my own exclusion from my father's last trip. She was quiet for a long moment before responding. Anderson, you need to seriously consider whether these people deserve your generosity. But it was my father's final adventure. How could I walk away from that? The final planning meeting 2 weeks before departure will forever be burned into my memory as the moment I learned what my family really thought of me. I had spent $35,000 by then, maxed out 2 credit cards, and taken a loan against my 401k. The trip had consumed every spare moment of my time and every dollar of my disposable income. I arrived at Caroline's house with my arms full of documentation. Medical equipment, rental agreements, hotel confirmations, RV contracts, insurance policies, emergency contact lists, and detailed day-by-day itineraries that accounted for Dad's treatment schedule and energy levels. I had researched every hospital along our route in case of emergencies. I had contacted Dad's oncologist to coordinate medication management during travel. I had even arranged for a portable oxygen concentrator in case his breathing became labored. Jake strolled in 20 minutes late wearing a complete outfit of expensive new outdoor gear. The hiking boots Caroline had bought him were just the beginning. Now he sported a $400 jacket, professional-grade climbing pants, and a backpack that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Everything still had tags on it. Caroline beamed with pride as she showed off Jake's new wardrobe like he was heading off to summit Mount Everest instead of accompanying a terminally ill man on a carefully planned road trip. Jake looks ready for anything, she gushed. I wanted to make sure he had everything he needed for all the activities. I bit my tongue and spread my papers across the dining room table. Okay, let's go through the final itinerary. I've coordinated everything around Dad's medical needs and energy levels. That's when Caroline and Jake exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. They had clearly been discussing something without me. Actually, Caroline said slowly, Jake and I have been talking, and we think your plan is a little too cautious. Dad's not dead yet. He should be able to enjoy some real adventures. Jake pulled out his phone and showed me a completely different itinerary he had created. Whitewater rafting in Colorado, rock climbing in Utah, multi-day camping excursions in remote areas with no cell service or nearby medical facilities. I stared at the screen in horror. Jake, Dad can barely walk to the mailbox without getting winded. These activities could literally kill him. That's exactly the kind of negative thinking that's the problem, Caroline said sharply. Dad needs people around him who believe in living life to the fullest, not people who treat him like he's already in a coffin. I looked at Dad, hoping he would see the insanity of what they were proposing. He was sitting in his recliner looking confused and overwhelmed by the argument brewing around him. I just want everyone to get along, he said weakly. Whatever you all think is best. That's when Caroline delivered the words that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Actually, Dad, Jake and I have been thinking that maybe Anderson should stay home. Jake knows how to handle all the outdoor stuff, and Dad needs someone who can actually take care of the physical aspects of the trip. The room went silent except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I looked at Caroline, convinced I had misheard. I'm sorry, what? Jake is basically family now, she continued calmly. You're just the sponsor. Dad needs someone who can help him with hiking and camping and all the activities that will actually make this trip memorable. Jake nodded along enthusiastically. Anderson, you can visit us at different stops if you want to see your dad. But let's be honest, you're more of an indoor person. This trip needs someone who understands adventure. I stared at them in absolute disbelief. My own sister was calmly explaining why I should be excluded from the trip I had planned and funded for my dying father. "Dad," I said, turning to him desperately. "This was supposed to be our time together. I've been planning this for months." Dad looked between Caroline and me with tired eyes. The medication made it hard for him to follow complex conversations, and he clearly just wanted the conflict to end. "Jake does know a lot about camping," he said softly, "and he's young and strong. Maybe that would be better for the outdoor parts." Caroline smiled triumphantly. "See, Dad agrees. Jake can take better care of him than you can." I felt like I was living in an alternate reality. My family had just voted me off of my own father's bucket list trip while expecting me to continue funding their vacation. Jake pulled out a notebook and started listing all the reasons he was better suited for the journey. He was outdoorsy, he was fun. He wasn't uptight about schedules. He knew how to handle emergencies. He could carry Dad if needed. Every reason was a thinly veiled insult directed at me. According to Jake, I was boring, weak, controlling, and incompetent. According to Caroline, I was useful for my wallet, but unnecessary for anything that actually mattered. I sat there listening to my family tear me apart while planning to spend my money on their adventure. The trip I had conceived as my final gift to Dad had been transformed into my public humiliation. As I drove home that night, I realized I had just learned the most painful lesson of my life. To my family, I wasn't a son or a brother. I was just a bank account with legs. The next morning, I woke up determined to get my money back and cancel everything. $35,000 was more than many people made in a year. I wasn't going to hand it over to people who saw me as nothing more than a walking ATM. I called Caroline and told her I wanted to meet to discuss the new arrangement. She agreed to come over sounding confident and almost smug. When she arrived with Jake in tow, I knew this conversation was going to be uglier than I had anticipated. "I've been thinking about yesterday," I began carefully, "and I don't think this new plan makes sense. If I'm not going on the trip, then I shouldn't be paying for it either." Caroline's expression immediately hardened. "Are you seriously going to hold Dad's happiness hostage over your hurt feelings?" "This isn't about hurt feelings, Caroline. This is about respect. You can't kick me off a trip I'm paying for and expect me to keep funding it." Jake leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, looking amused by my distress. "Come on, Anderson, don't be petty. This is about your dad, not your ego." "My ego?" I stood up, feeling my anger finally boiling over. "You invited yourself on this trip, then invited your brother, then convinced my sister to replace me with you, and now you're lecturing me about ego." Caroline jumped to Jake's defense immediately. "Jake is trying to help. You're the one making this about money and control." "I'm making this about money because it's my money," I shouted. "I worked overtime for months to afford this trip. I maxed out my credit cards. I borrowed against my retirement. And now you want to exclude me while I continue paying for your vacation." That's when Caroline showed me a side of her personality I had never seen before. Her face twisted with genuine cruelty as she launched into a character assassination that left me reeling. "You know what, Anderson? You've always been selfish. Even when we were kids, everything had to be about you. Mom died and you got all of Dad's attention because you were the baby. I had to grow up and take care of myself while Dad worried about precious Anderson." The accusations kept coming. I was controlling. I was manipulative. I used money to get my way. I couldn't handle not being the center of attention. According to Caroline, every generous thing I had ever done was actually a calculated attempt to make myself look good. Jake joined in with his own analysis of my character flaws. I was uptight. I was boring. I wouldn't know real adventure if it hit me in the face. I was the kind of corporate drone who scheduled fun instead of experiencing it. "This trip needs someone with a sense of spontaneity," Jake declared. "Someone who can help your dad live in the moment instead of following some rigid itinerary." I turned to Dad, who had been sitting quietly through this character assassination. "Dad, do you really think I'm selfish?" He looked uncomfortable and tired. "I just want everyone to get along. Can't we all just compromise?" But there was no compromise being offered. Caroline and Jake wanted me to pay for everything while staying home. When I refused, they painted me as the villain for prioritizing money over family. That's when I made a discovery that changed everything. While Caroline continued her rant about my character flaws, I noticed Jake's phone sitting on the coffee table. The screen was lit up with a text message notification from someone named Adventure Gear Sponsorship. Curious, I glanced at the message preview. Looking forward to the content from Frank's bucket list trip. The cancer angle will really resonate with our outdoor community. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the phone before Jake could stop me and scrolled through his text messages. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Jake had been in contact with multiple outdoor gear companies pitching them on sponsorship opportunities for Dad's trip. He had described it as a heartwarming story about a dying man's final adventure, complete with his loving son-in-law documenting the journey for social media. "Jix," I said slowly, "what is Adventure Gear Sponsorship?" He tried to grab his phone back, but I held it out of reach. "That's nothing, just some guys I know. These messages say you're planning to film the whole trip for a travel blog and YouTube channel. You've already got sponsorship deals lined up." Caroline's face went pale. "Jake, what is he talking about?" I kept reading the messages out loud. Jake had promised companies footage of Dad hiking in their gear. He had negotiated payment for product placement in videos. He had even discussed selling the story to outdoor magazines as an inspirational piece about family and adventure. "You've been planning to profit off my father's cancer," I said, my voice shaking with rage. Jake finally stopped pretending. So what? We're the ones doing all the work. We deserve to get something out of it." Caroline, to my amazement, actually defended him. "Anderson, if Jake can make some money documenting the trip, what's the harm? We'll be creating a beautiful memorial for Dad." I stared at her in disbelief. "The harm is that you've turned Dad's final adventure into a business opportunity. You're treating his cancer like content for your boyfriend's social media career." But the absolute worst part was yet to come. As I continued scrolling through Jake's phone, I found messages with Caroline where they discussed the timeline for the trip. According to their conversation, Caroline had lied about Dad's prognosis. The doctor hadn't said 6 months to live. He had said 6 months to 2 years, depending on how Dad responded to treatment. Caroline had manipulated the timeline to create artificial urgency, pressuring me into funding everything quickly before I could think it through. "Caroline," I said quietly, "you lied about how long Dad has." She looked caught but defiant. "The doctor said it could be as little as 6 months. I wanted to make sure we didn't waste time. You created a fake emergency to pressure me into spending my life savings." I looked at my father, who was listening to this revelation with growing confusion and hurt. His own daughter had exaggerated his death sentence to manipulate money out of his son. That's when something inside me snapped. These people weren't my family anymore. They were con artists who had figured out how to monetize Dad's illness while excluding the person paying for everything. I stood up and walked to the door. "You know what, you're right. Jake is better suited for this trip. You two deserve each other." Caroline looked relieved, thinking she had won. "So you'll still pay for everything?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Actually, no, since I'm just the sponsor and not family, I've decided to sponsor someone else's father instead." The look of panic that crossed their faces was absolutely priceless. I spent that night sitting in my apartment with Sarah, finally seeing my situation clearly for the first time in months. The people I had been trying to honor and care for were actually predators who had figured out how to exploit my love for my father. "You know what the worst part is," I told Sarah as we sat on my couch. "I've been enabling this behavior for years without realizing it." She nodded knowingly. "Caroline has always treated you like her personal bank account. Remember when she needed money for her wedding? Or when Jake's band needed equipment? You always just wrote the checks." I thought back over the past few years. Caroline's emergency car repairs that I paid for. Jake's medical bills that somehow became my responsibility. The down payment on their house that I contributed to as a loan that was never repaid. I had been funding their lifestyle while they contributed nothing but criticism and demands. The bucket list trip was just the latest and largest example of a pattern that had been going on for years. But this time felt different. This wasn't just about money. They were using Dad's cancer as a prop in their scheme to exclude me while taking credit for my generosity. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I made a decision that night. If Caroline and Jake wanted to profit from Dad's illness, they could do it without my money. The next morning, I called every vendor I had hired for the trip. The luxury RV rental company, the hotels, the medical equipment suppliers, the travel insurance company, even the private nurse I had arranged to accompany us. One by one, I canceled everything. The RV rental canceled. The 5-star hotel reservations canceled. The medical equipment canceled. The nurse canceled. The travel insurance canceled. Even the special meal arrangements canceled. With each phone call, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. These people had treated my generosity like an entitlement. They had twisted my love for my father into a business opportunity for themselves. They had excluded me from the very trip I had conceived and funded. But I wasn't done. I took the $35,000 I had already spent and had been planning to spend, and I donated every penny of it to a national charity that grants bucket list experiences to terminally ill patients and their families. The charity representative I spoke with was amazed by the size of the donation. She told me it would fund complete trips for 3 different families, including a father who wanted to take his children to Disney World, a grandmother who wanted to see the Northern Lights, and a young mother who wanted to visit every national park with her family before her cancer progressed. I asked them to send me photos and updates about the families they helped with my donation. I wanted to see what real love and gratitude looked like instead of the manipulation and exploitation I had experienced with my own family. Then I sat back and waited for Caroline and Jake to discover what I had done. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days before their planned departure date, Caroline called me in. A panic. The RV rental company had contacted her to confirm the cancellation of their reservation. When she tried to reinstate it, they told her the account holder had specifically canceled everything and requested no future contact. "Anderson, what did you do?" she screamed into the phone. "I exercised my rights as the person paying for everything," I said calmly. "Since I was just the sponsor and not family, I decided to sponsor other people's families instead." I could hear Jake in the background demanding to know what was happening. Caroline put me on speakerphone so he could join the conversation. "You can't just cancel everything," Jake shouted. "We have commitments. I have sponsors expecting content." "That sounds like your problem, not mine," I replied. "You wanted to exclude me from the trip. Mission accomplished." Caroline tried a different approach, switching to tears and guilt. "Anderson, think about Dad. This trip was his dying wish." "Dad can still go on a trip," I said. "You and Jake just need to plan and pay for it yourselves. I'm sure all those sponsorship deals Jake arranged will cover the costs." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Apparently, Jake's promised sponsorships weren't nearly as lucrative as he had implied. "Where did the money go?" Caroline asked desperately. "I donated it to families who actually appreciate generosity instead of seeing it as an opportunity to exploit someone." Over the next few days, I watched Caroline and Jake scramble to salvage their plans. They tried to book last-minute accommodations but couldn't afford anything decent. Jake's sponsors pulled out when they learned the trip was canceled. Caroline had to call in sick to work to deal with the crisis. Most importantly, Dad finally learned the truth about what had happened. Caroline had to explain to him why the trip wasn't happening anymore, which meant admitting how they had treated me and what their real motivations had been. According to my Aunt Ruth, who called to check on me, Dad was horrified when he learned about the sponsorship deals and the plan to exclude me. For the first time, he saw clearly how Caroline and Jake had manipulated the situation. Ruth also told me that Jake had abandoned Caroline once he realized there was no money to be made from the situation. Apparently, his love for the family wasn't strong enough to survive the loss of his meal ticket. 3 weeks after the canceled trip, Caroline called me crying. Jake had moved out, taking all the expensive gear she had bought him. The credit cards she had maxed out buying his equipment were now her responsibility alone. Her marriage was falling apart, and she had no way to afford the lifestyle Jake had convinced her they deserved. "Anderson, I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't realize how badly we treated you. Jake manipulated me into thinking you were being controlling." I listened to her apology with mixed feelings. Part of me felt sorry for her, but a larger part remembered how quickly she had turned on me when it suited her purposes. "I appreciate the apology, Caroline," I said, "but you weren't manipulated into treating me like an ATM. You chose to prioritize Jake over your own brother. You chose to lie about Dad's prognosis. You chose to try to exclude me from his final trip." She cried harder, begging me to forgive her and help her fix the mess she had created. But I had learned something important about myself over the past few months. My generosity wasn't limitless, and my family's love shouldn't come with conditions. "I forgive you," I told her, "but things are going to be different between us from now on." For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace with my decisions. 6 months passed before Dad reached out to me directly. I had been wondering when he would call, and honestly, I wasn't sure what I would say when he did. Our relationship had always been complicated by his tendency to avoid conflict and go along with whatever Caroline wanted. But the man who called me in late November was different from the one who had sat silently while his children fought over his bucket list trip. His voice was stronger, and his thinking was clearer. The new treatment regimen his oncologist had prescribed was working better than anyone had expected. "Anderson," he said simply, "I owe you an apology." I had waited months to hear those words, but now that they were coming, I felt more sad than vindicated. "Dad, you don't need to apologize for being sick." "I'm not apologizing for being sick," he said firmly. "I'm apologizing for being weak. I let Caroline and Jake manipulate the situation because it was easier than dealing with conflict. I failed you as a father." We talked for 2 hours that day. Dad told me things about the aftermath of the canceled trip that I hadn't heard from anyone else. How Jake had immediately started looking for his next opportunity once he realized the money was gone. How Caroline had tried to blame me for ruining everything instead of taking responsibility for her choices. How Dad himself had spent weeks thinking about what kind of man raises children who treat generosity as an entitlement. "I never taught you kids about gratitude," he said. "I was so busy trying to provide for everyone after your mother died that I forgot to teach you how to appreciate what you have." But more importantly, Dad had been doing research on the charity I had donated to. He had read about the families who received bucket list trips with my money, and he had seen photos of their adventures. Instead of being bitter about missing his own trip, he was proud that his situation had led to joy for other people. "Those families got something real," he said. "What Caroline and Jake were planning wasn't about making memories with me. It was about making content for strangers." Dad asked if I would be willing to plan a simple trip, just the two of us. Nothing elaborate or expensive. He wanted to visit his childhood home in Montana and show me places that had been important to him growing up. No luxury hotels or medical equipment, just a father and son spending time together. I agreed, but with conditions. No other family members could know about the trip until it was over. No social media documentation. No agenda beyond spending time together and talking about things we had never discussed. We left on a cold Saturday morning in December, driving my reliable Honda Civic instead of a luxury RV. Dad had regained enough strength to travel comfortably, and his oncologist had cleared him for the journey as long as we stayed within driving distance of major hospitals. The 12-hour drive to Montana gave us more uninterrupted conversation time than we had shared in 20 years. Dad told me stories about his own father who had died when Dad was young. He explained how becoming a single parent had changed his priorities and made him focus on survival instead of emotional connection. "I thought providing for you was the same as loving you," he said as we drove through the Colorado mountains. "I worked all those jobs to prove I was a good father, but I never actually spent time being one." We talked about Mom and how her death had affected both of us differently. Dad had thrown himself into work to avoid grieving. I had thrown myself into academic achievement to make him proud. Neither of us had really processed losing her. You turned out better than I deserved, Dad said quietly. You learned how to love people without keeping score. I never taught you that. You figured it out on your own. When we reached Montana, Dad directed me to the small town where he had grown up. We visited his old elementary school, now converted into a community center. We drove past the house where he had lived with his parents, now occupied by a young family with children playing in the yard. Most importantly, we visited Mom's grave in the cemetery outside town. Dad had moved her body there after we left Montana when I was young, but he had never taken me to see where she was buried. We stood together in the cold December air looking at her headstone. Dad told me stories about their courtship and early marriage that I had never heard. How they had met at a church dance, how she had convinced him to move to Colorado for better job opportunities, how excited she had been when Caroline was born and later when I came along. She would have been ashamed of how Caroline treated you, Dad said. Your mother believed in family loyalty. Real loyalty, not the fake kind that disappears when money gets involved. We stayed in Montana for 3 days, visiting Dad's childhood haunts and talking about everything we had never discussed. Dad's fears about dying, my struggles with dating and career decisions, the ways we had both failed each other over the years without meaning to. On our last evening, we sat on the porch of a small bed and breakfast, watching the sunset over the mountains. Dad looked healthier and more at peace than I had seen him in years. Anderson, he said, I need you to know something. What you did with that donation wasn't petty or vindictive. It was the right choice. You showed those families what generosity actually looks like. He pulled out his phone and showed me an email he had received from the charity. One of the families I had sponsored had sent a thank you letter with photos from their trip. A father with brain cancer had been able to take his young daughter to Disney World, where she got to meet her favorite princess and ride every attraction twice. That little girl will remember that trip for the rest of her life, Dad said. Her father gave her something beautiful before he died. That's what a bucket list should be about. We drove home in comfortable silence, both of us understanding that our relationship had fundamentally changed. Not because of the money or the canceled trip, but because we had finally been honest with each other about who we were and what we needed. Caroline called me the day after we returned, somehow having learned about the trip through family gossip. She was hurt that she hadn't been invited, but she didn't demand an explanation or make the conversation about her feelings. I'm glad you and Dad got to spend time together, she said quietly. I know I don't deserve to be included in things like that anymore. Her marriage to Jake had officially ended 2 months earlier. He had left her with significant debt and a clearer understanding of what real love looked like versus what manipulation felt like. I'm starting therapy, she told me. I need to figure out why I was so willing to hurt people who cared about me. I was proud of her for taking that step, but I also knew that rebuilding our relationship would take time and consistent changes in her behavior. Dad's health continued to improve throughout the winter. His oncologist was amazed by his response to treatment and upgraded his prognosis significantly. Instead of months, we were now talking about years. But more importantly than the extra time, Dad seemed to have rediscovered his sense of purpose. He started volunteering at a local hospice, spending time with other terminal patients who didn't have family support. He used the perspective from his own experience to help people facing similar diagnoses. Funny thing about almost dying, he told me during one of our weekly dinners. It teaches you the difference between what matters and what doesn't. Family matters. Love matters. Everything else is just noise. I started joining him at the hospice, sometimes helping families navigate the practical aspects of end-of-life planning. We met people who had been abandoned by relatives and others who were surrounded by love and support. The contrast helped me appreciate what we had rebuilt together. A year later, I received a package in the mail that brought everything full circle. Inside was a handwritten letter from Sarah, the 8-year-old daughter of the Disney World family my donation had sponsored. Her father had passed away 6 months after their trip, but Sarah had drawn me a picture of her and her dad meeting Mickey Mouse. Dear Mr. Anderson, she had written in careful second-grade handwriting, thank you for giving me and Daddy the best week ever. He told me angels sent us to Disney World, and I think you must be one of them. Daddy said I should always remember to help other people like you helped us. Enclosed with the letter was a photo of Sarah and her father on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, both of them laughing and wearing matching Mickey Mouse ears. Her dad looked weak, but incredibly happy. Sarah looked like the most joyful child in the world. I called the charity that had facilitated the donation and learned that all 3 families I had sponsored had completed their trips successfully. The grandmother who wanted to see the Northern Lights had passed away peacefully 2 months after her adventure, but not before experiencing the magical aurora dancing across the Alaskan sky. The young mother visiting national parks had created a photo album that her children would treasure forever, documenting their last healthy summer together before her treatment became too intensive for travel. These were the stories Caroline and Jake had claimed they wanted to create, but the difference was authenticity. These families experienced real joy and genuine gratitude because their trips were about love, not content creation. Dad and I continued our tradition of simple road trips, visiting different states and national monuments without any agenda beyond spending time together. His health remained stable, giving us opportunities to build memories that actually mattered. We never documented these trips on social media or treated them as anything other than precious time together. Caroline completed her therapy and reached out to apologize again, this time with deeper understanding of how her behavior had affected our family. She had learned to recognize the manipulation tactics Jake had used on her, and she was working to rebuild her life without depending on others for financial support. "I spent so many years thinking you owed me things because Dad loved you more," she admitted during one difficult conversation. "But the truth is you earned Dad's respect by being generous and reliable. I tried to take shortcuts instead of doing the work." We were slowly rebuilding our relationship, but with clear boundaries. I would help Caroline in genuine emergencies, but not for lifestyle choices or poor financial planning. She would treat my generosity as a gift, not an expectation. Most importantly, I learned to recognize the difference between people who appreciate generosity and people who exploit it. The charity families sent thank you notes and updates about how the trips had impacted their lives. They understood that what I had given them was precious and irreplaceable. Caroline and Jake had treated my sacrifice as the starting point for negotiations. The hospice work taught me even more about authentic relationships. I met dozens of people facing death who were surrounded by family members fighting over inheritance and possessions. I also met people with very little money whose loved ones showed up consistently just to spend time together. The difference wasn't about wealth or education or social status. It was about whether people saw relationships as transactions or as sources of meaning. 2 years after the canceled trip, Jake reached out to me through social media. He had apparently started a successful YouTube channel about outdoor adventures, but he wanted to do a video about family reconciliation and learning from mistakes. I declined his request immediately. Some people never learn that relationships aren't content opportunities. But I did start sharing my story in a different way. During my hospice volunteering, I began talking to families about the importance of authentic bucket list experiences. Not adventures designed for social media, but meaningful time spent focusing on love and connection. I helped one elderly man plan a simple fishing trip with his grandson funded by community donations after his insurance wouldn't cover the travel costs. I assisted a young mother in organizing a backyard camping adventure for her children when her illness made distant travel impossible. These experiences taught me that the most precious gifts are often the simplest ones. Dad celebrated his 72nd birthday surrounded by genuine family and friends who cared about him as a person, not as a source of dramatic content. We kept the celebration small and focused on gratitude rather than spectacle. During his birthday dinner, Dad stood up to make a toast that surprised everyone. "I want to thank my son Anderson for teaching me what real love looks like," he said, raising his glass. "When I was sick, a lot of people saw an opportunity. Anderson saw a father who needed care and respect. The difference saved my life in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. I realized that night that the canceled bucket list trip had given me something more valuable than any vacation could have provided. It showed me who I could count on when things got difficult, and it taught me to value authentic relationships over convenient ones. The charity continues to send me updates about the families they help with ongoing donations I make throughout the year. Each story reminds me that generosity works best when it flows toward people who understand its value. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to show you who they really are. Caroline and Jake showed me exactly who they were when money and attention were on the table. The charity families showed me what gratitude and love actually look like. I wouldn't change anything about how the situation unfolded. The pain taught me lessons about boundaries and self-respect that I needed to learn. The resolution gave me a deeper relationship with Dad and a clearer understanding of what family should mean. As I finish telling this story, I want to leave you with a question that might help you reflect on your own relationships. Think about the people in your life who have supported you through difficult times. Did they show up because they cared about you or because they saw an opportunity for themselves? The answer to that question tells you everything you need to know about who deserves your generosity and trust. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something similar with family or friends? How did you handle it? Please hit the like button. If this story made you think differently about relationships and boundaries, don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about family love and learning to stand up for yourself. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message about recognizing authentic relationships, please share this story with them. Thank you for listening to my story and for understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable people who take your kindness for granted. I hope you find the courage to surround yourself with people who appreciate your generosity instead of exploiting it, and I wish you the wisdom to know the difference.